Hello, and welcome to Our Special Lives. Today we're continuing a three-part series for children with feeding tubes on feeding and venting. And we're down to the last segment, which is how-tos and some top tips for syringe feeding, including gravity feeding. We're not specifically covering feeding for infants less than a year old or children who use feeding pumps, but I'm linking to an awesome resource below which has tons of information on feeding with feeding pumps. But even if you're not using a feeding pump, I would still encourage you to watch. We used to use a feeding pump, and once we were able to graduate to syringe feeding, it was a real game changer for us. And before we get started, if you like these topics and want to hear more, please hit like and subscribe. To remind you, in the first segment, we talked about comfort and making sure that the tube feeding is going well, and then developing a plan B for when it isn't going well. In the second segment, we talked about venting, how to do it, and what it can tell you about your child's food needs and tolerance. You'll want to check those out. And now, let's get started with syringe feeding. First, let's talk for a minute about the advantages of syringe feeding over pump feeding. Assuming, of course, that syringe feeding is safe for your child. Always check with your child's healthcare practitioner. Why we like syringe feeding is 1, it can be a more personal interaction with your child. 2, it can be more convenient because if you're not using a pump, you don't have a need for electricity and your device can't malfunction. Third, it's much more convenient when you're out of the home, like at the doctor or therapist or traveling to syringe feed. Fourth, syringe feeding allows blenderized food to be administered, which is typically not thin enough to use with a feeding pump. Lastly, bolus feeding, or feeding a larger meal-sized quantity over about 20 or 30 minutes at 3 to 4 intervals a day, more closely mimics a natural eating pattern. You can do this with a feeding pump, but it's a little easier with a syringe. The equipment that you'll need to syringe feed includes a 35 ml syringe for venting, a 60 ml Miracle O-ring syringe, a 32 milliliter graduate, flush water, and hand towels. Okay, let's talk about the two different types of syringe feeding. Syringe push, which is our preferred method, and open syringe or gravity feeding. We'll talk about both. Syringe push is just like what it sounds. You pull up food into the syringe and push the contents of the syringe through the feeding tube. Open syringe is where you remove the plunger from the syringe, pour food into the syringe, and allow the food to flow into the stomach using gravity. This is why it's also called gravity feeding. And some children use bags instead of syringes to gravity feed. Here is a clip of starting a syringe push feed of a blended diet. The first step is warming the food in a 32-ounce graduate. We put the food in one graduate and then put that graduate in another graduate with some warm water for about 10 minutes before feeding. This thins the food, which makes it easier to feed, and we also stir the food to reincorporate the liquid in the blended food, like in this clip. Many people also find that giving free water about 20 or 30 minutes before the meal helps the meal go better. We'll talk about free water later. Okay, we're starting the feeding with a water flush and vent to ensure that there's no extra air in my son's stomach and he's starting the feed in a comfortable way. Now you'll see that we're beginning our syringe feed. We're pulling food into the syringe. And the first thing we do is make sure that we very carefully wipe the exterior of the syringe and especially the tip so that we get a good seal between the syringe and the feeding extension. This ensures that the food stays in the syringe and feeding extension, and it overall just ensures a less messy feeding. Now we're continuing to slowly push the food And we're always keeping an eye on my son to make sure his demeanor hasn't changed and he's continuing to tolerate the food he's receiving. After we've pushed a few syringes of food, we're going to pull up some free water and we're going to flush and vent him to make sure he's staying comfortable and make sure we're getting a good flow in and out of the feeding tube. Once we've periodically flushed and vented, we continue to slowly push the feed through the syringe, and we're also making sure that the syringe and the feeding extension are out of reach of his hand so that he can't pull on the feeding extension and accidentally dislodge his feeding tube. Okay, now let's talk about gravity feeding. In my opinion, the big pro of gravity feeding or open syringe is that the stomach really only takes the amount of food it has room for, and you can slow the rate of flow by moving the syringe from above the stomach to at or below the stomach level. In this clip, we gravity feed using the straight tip bolus feeding extension, which is a wider tube than the Y-port feeding extension. It's much easier to gravity feed using this extension. Here you can see we're using the bolus feeding extension, which as you can see is a little bit thicker than the normal Y-port feeding tube. We unclip the extension and pour the food directly into the top of the syringe. You can hold the syringe straight above the stomach and that's going to produce the best and fastest flow. You can see how the food is quickly draining into my son's stomach. And if we want to slow it down, we can move it a little further down to the level of his stomach, and you can see how that has stopped the flow of food. And then if we bring it up again, the food flow continues. The con of gravity feeding is that your child must remain relatively still during the process. So if your child is very active or has a movement disorder like cerebral palsy, food can end up anywhere but inside your child's stomach. And it can also present a safety issue that we'll talk about in a minute. Gravity feeding can be a great tool to use when you're transitioning from a feeding pump to a syringe feeding or bolus feeding because it's harder to overfeed your child, and it gives you a good idea about the best volume and rate for your child for a larger meal-sized quantity. Syringe push has the advantage of giving the caregiver more control of the food and feeding process. The food can be pushed in any position relative to the child, so you can keep the syringe and the feeding extension out of reach of an active child. This is particularly important if your child's movements risk their hand getting caught under the feeding extension or pulling the feeding extension, which can actually dislodge the feeding tube from the stomach. Like in this clip, which we were shooting to demonstrate this concept, my son almost pulled his feeding tube out for real, which is why for us, we never gravity feed. Another consideration for tube feeding is making sure that your child is getting adequate free water. Sometimes the importance of free water is not fully understood, or perhaps it hasn't been specifically addressed in conversations with your healthcare practitioner. It may seem like a blended diet or even a formula diet because it's liquid would provide enough hydration, but it doesn't. And typically, a formula-based diet requires less supplemental water, and blenderized diets require a little more supplemental water, but it's always a good idea to check with your doctor and check each year because your child's fluid needs change as the child grows. I've included a link below to give you an idea of hydration requirements for children. As an example, in addition to his blended diet, our 10-year-old son requires 32 ounces of free water a day, or the equivalent of 4 8-ounce glasses of water. We calculated that by determining that his daily total fluid need was about 70 ounces. We took the total ounces of blended food he receives, about 50 ounces, and multiplied that by 0.75 because 3/4 of his blended food is considered liquid or fluid. And then we subtracted that from 70 and got 32 ounces of water. But again, please check with your child's healthcare practitioner for your child's requirements. Hydration is so key to health and wellness, but you also don't want to overdo it. Lastly, we have 5 more quick tips to help with feeding. 1. Sometimes feeding extensions don't come with clips. If you've received one without a clip, you can crimp the extension to cut off the food flow or keep food in the stomach between syringes of food, like in this clip. 2, sometimes you'll notice a lot of resistance when you push food or medication through the syringe. Watch out for crimps in the feeding extension and roll them out, like in this clip. If you've done that and you're still getting resistance, try reverse venting like we talked about in the last video. And lastly, try switching out the feeding extension for a new one. If you're still getting resistance, you may have a clogged feeding tube. I have included a link below with more information on what to do in that situation. 3, when you're done feeding, flush the 60cc syringe with some soapy water, and then every few feedings, use coconut or olive oil around that O-ring, which will make the syringe glide easier and it will make your feeding easier. And lastly, if you want to keep the feeding extension on for free water and medications between feedings, we've found that it's best to place that feeding extension out of the collar of the shirt. We found that it's the least likely place that it can get pulled or caught on a wheelchair or piece of equipment, and it also doesn't get inadvertently unclipped, which causes stomach contents and medication to occasionally leak out. So those are the basics on syringe feeding. I'm going to link to other resources that parents can read for further information on this topic. To anyone who's watching, if you liked this video, please hit like and hit subscribe if you'd like to hear more on these topics. And please leave me a comment or drop me a line at ourspeciallives.com. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, everyone.